There is a version of Britain that most people under 50 have never actually seen. A Britain where the sound of a town was not traffic or television, but hammers on steel and the low grinding hum of machinery that never really stopped. A Britain that built ships for the entire world, dug coal from beneath its own streets, and put cars on roads from Birmingham to Bombay. That Britain is gone now, and tonight we are going to walk through exactly how it disappeared and what it actually cost the people who lived it. This is not a story about statistics on a graph. It is a story about communities that were told, almost overnight, that the thing that had defined them for generations no longer had a place in the world. Fathers who had assumed their sons would follow them into the same yard, the same pit, the same works, suddenly had nothing to hand down at all. Let us start at the beginning, on a river in Scotland that once built more ships than almost anywhere else on Earth. The River Clyde, running through Glasgow, had been one of the most important shipbuilding centres on the planet. During the First World War, shipyards along the Clyde produced roughly 80% of the entire world's shipping output. Think about that number for a moment. 80%. Nearly every ship on every ocean, in some way, owed its existence to those yards. By 1970, that same figure had collapsed to just 5%. Try to picture what that means for the men who worked those yards. The same skills, the same hands, the same tools, and yet the demand for what they built had simply drained away from underneath them, decade by decade, while the wider world kept building ships somewhere else, faster and cheaper. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to destroy the Clyde. It happened slowly enough that for a long time it was easy to convince yourself it was temporary. What happened in between was decades of underinvestment, aging equipment, and a global shipping industry that had simply moved on, while Clyde owners hesitated to modernize. In 1968, several of the surviving yards, including those at Clydebank, Govan, Lindhouse and Scotstoun, were merged into a single consortium called Upper Clyde Shipbuilders, employing around 8,500 workers. It was meant to be a rescue. It was not enough. In June of 1971, the government of the day announced it would withdraw financial support entirely. For thousands of families across Glasgow, this was not an abstract policy decision. It was the end of a way of life passed down through fathers and sons for generations. But here is the part almost nobody expects. The workers did not walk out. They did not riot. They did something far more powerful. Led by a shop steward named Jimmy Reed, they staged what became known as a work-in. Instead of striking, they kept working, refusing to let the yards close, insisting that Britain and the world could see exactly what was being thrown away. Reed told the men there would be no drinking, no vandalism, no hooliganism, because this was not a mob. This was a workforce proving its own worth. The reaction was extraordinary. In August of 1971, roughly 200,000 workers across Scotland stopped work in solidarity, and 80,000 marched through the streets of Glasgow. Support came from unexpected places too. John Lennon and Yoko Ono sent a check for £1,000 along with a bouquet of red roses and a note that simply read, "Power to the people." By February of 1972, the government reversed its decision. Around 6,500 of the original 8,500 jobs were saved. It felt like a genuine victory, and in many ways it was. But pay close attention here, because this is the pattern that repeats itself again and again throughout this story. A victory that saves jobs today rarely stops the underlying decline. Over the following 2 decades, shipbuilding on the Clyde continued to shrink, yard by yard, contract by contract, until almost nothing remained of what had once been the greatest shipbuilding river on Earth. That destruction went hand in hand with a similar story unfolding across the British car industry, though this one had a different shape entirely. It was not a slow bleed. It was closer to a slow-motion collapse of one of the most famous names in British manufacturing. British Leyland had once represented everything the country was proud of on 4 wheels. It built the Mini, a small car that became a genuine cultural icon far beyond Britain's borders. It built the Jaguar E-Type, a car so beautiful that it was reportedly once called the most beautiful car ever made by a legendary figure in the industry. It built the Land Rover, which found its way onto farms, battlefields and expeditions across every continent on Earth. These were not niche products built for a small domestic market. They were genuine global icons, the kind of vehicles that made people abroad think of Britain as a country that still knew how to build things brilliantly, that the rest of the world actually wanted to own. And yet underneath the badge and the glamour, the company was falling apart. Outdated factories, fragmented management structures that made decisions painfully slow, labor relations that had deteriorated into a near-constant cycle of walkouts and disputes. By 1975, British Leyland was essentially insolvent, unable to meet its own financial obligations. Facing the prospect of hundreds of thousands of job losses if the company simply collapsed, the government stepped in and nationalized it, taking it into public ownership in an attempt to save what remained. Nationalization prevented an immediate collapse. It did not fix anything underneath. The same outdated factories remained outdated. The same fractured management remained fractured. In 1977, a new chairman named Michael Edwards was brought in with a clear mandate: sort out the mess, whatever that required. He proved willing to make decisions his predecessors had avoided, closing plants and cutting jobs in an attempt to drag the company back toward viability. It was not enough to reverse the deeper trend. As Japanese manufacturers entered the British market with cars that were more reliable and often cheaper to produce, British Leyland's mid-range models became increasingly uncompetitive. Now here is the detail that matters most. Before this collapse, Britain could genuinely claim to stand alongside Germany, the United States, and Japan in overall industrial capability. After it, Britain was left with only a handful of specialists. Rolls-Royce and Bentley at the ultra-luxury end. Morgan, still hand-building sports cars in small numbers. Lotus, focused on lightweight performance engineering. The mid-range British car industry, the part that had once employed hundreds of thousands of ordinary workers and sold to customers across the entire world, essentially vanished. The specialists that survived were remarkable in their own right, but they were a fraction of what had existed before, employing thousands rather than hundreds of thousands. An entire tier of British manufacturing, the ordinary family car built by ordinary workers for ordinary people, simply stopped existing within the space of a single generation. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel if any of this is bringing back memories of your own, because we bring stories like this back to life every single week. If a name or a place in this video means something to you personally, tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this is resonating with you, take a moment to like the video and share it with someone who lived through these years alongside you. Ships and cars were only part of the picture. Underneath both industries sat something even more fundamental, the steel that built them in the first place. And that industry was collapsing just as fast. In the 1960s, British Steel employed roughly 268,500 people across the country. That is not a typo. Over 250,000 people working across furnaces, rolling mills, and processing plants that had powered British industry for a century. And demand for steel plummeted alongside the closure of shipyards and a series of harsh recessions through the 1980s. That workforce began to disappear at a devastating pace. Individual closures tell the human side of this story better than any national statistic ever could. Behind every one of those closures sat thousands of individual mornings, men clocking in for what turned out to be the very last time, not always knowing it was the last time until the notice went up on the gate. Multiply that single morning by every works, every yard, and every pit across the country, and you begin to understand the true scale of what was lost. In May of 1979, the Bilston Steelworks in the West Midlands shut its gates for good. For the town of Bilston, the works had not just been a source of employment, it had shaped the entire identity of the place, the rhythm of family life, the sense of who people were and what their town meant. Contemporary local television and newspaper coverage from that period captured something striking. The way people in the town almost immediately began speaking about their own community, with a kind of nostalgia, even while the closure was still unfolding around them, as though they already understood they were watching something irreplaceable disappear in real time. There is something almost unbearably honest about that reaction. These were not people looking back decades later through a haze of sentiment. They were living through the closure in real time, and even then they already sensed exactly how permanent it was going to be. Grief in that sense arrived before the loss had even fully happened. The pattern continued into Scotland. In 1992, the Ravenscraig Steelworks closed its doors. bringing an end to steelmaking in Scotland entirely, a country whose industrial identity had been built on exactly that kind of heavy manufacturing for well over a century. What had once been a defining feature of the Scottish economy simply ceased to exist. Steelmaking in Scotland had roots stretching back well over a century, tied up with the same rivers and the same shipyards that had once made the country famous around the world. When Ravenscraig closed, it did not just end one factory's operations. It severed one of the last remaining threads connecting modern Scotland to the industrial identity that had shaped it for generations. But if there is one single event that captures the full human cost of Britain's industrial collapse, it is not steel, and it is not ships, it is coal. And what happened underground and on the picket lines above it changed the country permanently. By 1979, Margaret Thatcher had taken office as Britain's first female Prime Minister, inheriting a country gripped by recession, rising inflation, and growing unemployment. She held a firm belief in individual economic freedom and a deep skepticism toward the power that trade unions had accumulated over previous decades. The National Coal Board, the state body responsible for Britain's coal industry, became the site of the most significant confrontation of her premiership. In March of 1984, the National Coal Board announced plans to close 20 coal pits, putting roughly 20,000 jobs at immediate risk. Arthur Scargill, leader of the National Union of Mine Workers, argued publicly that the true figure was far higher, closer to 75 pits scheduled for eventual closure. Long same day, miners at a colliery in South Yorkshire walked off the job, and Scargill used the moment to call a nationwide strike. What followed was the longest mass strike in modern British history. Roughly 3/4 of the country's 187,000 miners walked out, concentrated heavily in militant areas like Yorkshire and South Wales, while the Nottinghamshire coalfield largely kept working, a division that would leave deep and lasting bitterness between communities for decades afterward. Neighbours who had once shared the same working conditions, the same union, the same understanding of what the job demanded of them, suddenly found themselves standing on opposite sides of picket lines. Some of those divisions between families and even within them never fully healed, not even decades later. Pay close attention to this next part, because it is the moment the entire conflict turned genuinely violent. On the 18th of June 1984, roughly 10,000 striking miners confronted around 5,000 police officers at a British steel coking plant in Orgreave, South Yorkshire. What became known as the Battle of Orgreave left 51 miners and 72 police officers injured. Dozens of miners were arrested in the aftermath. Years later, the prosecutions against many of them collapsed entirely after it emerged that police officers had fabricated elements of their evidence. As the months dragged on, conditions for striking families deteriorated sharply. In October of 1984, the National Union of Mine Workers had its financial assets frozen, cutting off one of the union's main sources of support for its members. A change in the law meant that the families of striking miners were no longer entitled to certain state benefits, unlike during previous strikes in the 1970s. A donation of $1 million from Soviet miners, personally authorized by the future Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, was ultimately blocked before it could reach British mining communities. By early 1985, with the government's strategy of stockpiling coal at power stations meaning that electricity supplies were never seriously threatened, increasing numbers of exhausted, financially desperate miners began drifting back to work through picket lines, where they were branded, painfully, as strikebreakers by former colleagues and neighbors. On the 3rd of March 1985, following a narrow vote by the union's national executive, the strike officially ended after 362 days. Miners returned to their pits accompanied by brass bands and banners, putting on a brave face over what was, unmistakably, a defeat. Imagine walking back through those gates after almost a full year without wages, without certainty, having watched your union's funds frozen and your neighbors turn against each other, knowing full well that everything you had fought to prevent was about to happen anyway. The bands and the banners were not celebration, they were dignity, chosen deliberately, in the face of a loss that was already impossible to undo. The consequences unfolded exactly as the miners had feared, and exactly as they had warned. In one blunt, unforgettable slogan chanted on picket lines throughout the strike, "Close a pit, kill a community." In 1984, there had been 174 working deep coal mines across Britain. By 1994, the year the industry was fully privatized, only 15 remained. The final deep coal mine in Britain, Kellingley Colliery, closed permanently in the year 2015, bringing centuries of underground coal mining in this country to a complete and final end. Think about what that closure actually represented. Coal had been pulled from beneath British soil for hundreds of years. Through wars, through empire, through the Industrial Revolution itself, and then, within a single working lifetime, the entire practice simply stopped. Somewhere, a miner who started his career in the 1970s would have lived to see the very last shift at the very last pit in the country he had spent his whole working life serving. Now step back for a moment and look at the wider picture all of this sits inside. Since the mid-1960s, British manufacturing as a whole has shed more than 6 million jobs, not from one single industry, not from one single strike or one single closure, but from a decades-long, interconnected collapse across steel, ships, cars and coal, each one weakening the others as it fell. There is a particular kind of unfairness worth sitting with here. The men and women who worked in these industries were not asking for charity. They were doing dangerous, physically brutal work, often for modest pay, because it was simply what their town, their family, their whole community had always done. In 1981 alone, there were 500 fatal accidents among British miners. That is the reality the romantic version of these stories tends to leave out. It was hard work and it was often literally dangerous. And it was still their entire world. Nobody fought this hard to defend an easy job. They fought to defend the only job available, in towns built entirely around a single industry, where the pit or the yard or the works was not simply where you happened to be employed. It was the reason the town existed in the first place. When the pits closed, when the yards fell silent, when the steelworks shut their gates for the final time, it was never just a job that disappeared. It was the pub that depended on those wages. It was the football club that depended on those season ticket holders. It was the identity of an entire town, built up over generations, gone within a matter of months. Economists can measure lost output and falling employment figures easily enough. What is much harder to measure is what happens to a community's sense of who it is once the thing that defined it for 100 years simply stops existing. Some of what replaced these industries has genuinely been positive. Britain's service sector, finance, education, professional services has grown substantially, and it has kept the wider economy moving forward even as manufacturing continued to shrink. But that growth was heavily concentrated in London and the South East, while many of the old industrial towns in Scotland, the North East, South Wales, and the Midlands never fully recovered the sense of purpose, or the sheer number of steady jobs that coal, steel, ships and cars had once provided. Drive through some of those towns today, and you can still see the shape of what used to be there. The vast empty footprint where a colliery once stood, a shipyard gate that now leads to nothing but overgrown land, a steelworks chimney left standing as a monument rather than a working structure. The buildings came down mostly. What proved far harder to rebuild was everything those buildings used to hold together. The steady wages, the shared identity, the sense that a young person growing up there had a clear and dignified path into adult working life. So here is what I want to leave you with. This was never really a story about industries failing on their own. It was a story about decisions, made in boardrooms and government offices, that rippled outward into the daily lives of millions of ordinary families who had very little say in any of it. The workers at Upper Clyde Shipbuilders understood that instinctively when they refused to simply walk away in 1971. The miners understood it too, chanting their warning on picket lines throughout that brutal winter of 1984. Close a pit, kill a community. They were not exaggerating. They were describing exactly what was about to happen. If any part of this took you back to a town you grew up in, a father or grandfather who worked in one of these industries, or a strike your own family lived through, tell us about it in the comments below, because those memories are exactly what keep this history honest. If this video meant something to you, give it a like, share it with someone who would understand why, and subscribe, because there are many more stories like this one still waiting to be told.